down paths where you are hopeful that you're going to find,
Mhm.
that pot of gold. Like I went into this story just determined I'm going to find Bridget's diaries or some letters or that treasure trove of stuff, right? But she was a poor immigrant widow that she just didn't they didn't save her collected papers back then. She was just barely staying alive and keeping her family together. So I never did find that treasure trove I was hoping for. um, but I came at it from multiple angles and found little bits and pieces here and there, plus other historical sort of references that helped me sort of bring her story to life. Among them were city directories and newspaper articles from back in the day. I've become a huge fan of newspapers.com, if some of you are familiar with that.
Mhm.
I think I'm on it almost every day now. Like, research on this is long gone. I'm on to other projects, but I think it's a fabulous resource. And I was able to find stories from the 1850s that would give me little nuggets about what life was like on the streets of East Boston at that time, including narrowing down specific dates and figuring out what the weather was like or other important things that were going on at that time. I just love that process. With Bridget, I had to get over my frustration of not being able to find everything. But there were a lot of collected papers that I was able to dig through in Boston at various places. Boston College and the Boston City Archives was amazing. JFK Library, where I know you spent time, Kate, they were super helpful, and I found a lot there about things that came later. When it came to Bridget, they just didn't have a lot either. It just didn't survive her, unfortunately. I reached out to a lot of family members to see if anyone had some, little envelope of stuff or a photo album, and they were all gracious and tried to help, but to a person said, we don't know. Like, we didn't know her story either.
Mm.
At one point I talked to Maria Shriver, who said, I wish I could help, but I can't. And I look forward to reading your book and learning more about my own family. They just didn't know. So in Bridget's case, what I did start to piece together was that after Patrick died, she didn't disappear, right? She just put her head down and got back to work for a while as a maid, as she had been working for a while. And then I discovered that she ended up working at the well-known department store called Jordan Marsh. She worked in the women's department, it was called, as a hairdresser, and in time rose to become the chief hairdresser at Jordan Marsh. I think it was Washington Street in downtown Boston. So she would commute by ferry because East Boston was separated before the tunnel, and that was the only way in. A niece watched the kids as they were getting older, and that allowed Bridget to go work and make money for the family. And I thought that little pivot right there said a lot about her.
Mm.
This desire to do something more, and something that doesn't sound like much now, maybe, but at the time when you've got 4 kids and you're alone and you're taking the ferry across to downtown Boston, a city that doesn't want people like you at all, and you're like, screw it. I mean, I need a job and I want a better job than the one I had, and this is the one I'm going after. And she worked there for a number of years and really did well for herself. I think that alone says a lot about her character, her ability to find a job, hold it, and then learn more about Boston itself and the people who would soon become her customers, because the next step is even more impressive as she becomes her own business owner.
Well, and I love that part of the book because she's a fierce mother and she is going to do everything that she needs to do to protect those children and raise them. And of course, we all, New Englanders know about Jordan Marsh, and the fact that she was one of those early, employees back then as an Irish immigrant is really stunning. And of course, those Boston Brahmin women are going to Jordan Marsh and they're having their
Right.
hair done. And I mean, it's just incredible. So I want to get to in a few minutes about the relevance of this story today, as you said, it kind of sparked for you in 2016 when these issues started really becoming controversial and in the news a lot. But before we get to that, I want to hear a little bit more about, where Bridget went. She wasn't a hairdresser forever.
Right.
And she had aspirations, because we know the Kennedys today, or we think we do, and they are an immensely successful family. They have their roots in Patrick and Bridget, the widow hairdresser, and they end up this incredibly important family, wealthy, service oriented.
Right.
So where did you see that emerging in your research?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that began, and you do see it sort of continue through the family from that point forward. I think it began with Bridget deciding after working at Jordan Marsh that she wanted to work for herself. And I know she borrowed money. I don't know from whom. There's evidence that her boss at Jordan Marsh, Eben Jordan, who co-founded the department store, was very gracious to some of his employees, might have helped give her a leg up. But what she did around the time of at the end of the Civil War, was open her own small business, a little grocery shop in East Boston. It starts popping up in city directories in the mid 1860s and continues on for the next 20 years. Didn't really have a name. It's referred to in the directories as different things, Shop by Kennedy or just B. Kennedy. But she became an entrepreneur at a time when women, one, and immigrant widows, two, and three, it just didn't happen. So I think that right there says a lot, all you need to know about Bridget, really. Like, she opened her own business, little grocery store, sold, food and coffee and tea and produce and things. It wasn't much. There's also evidence that she probably sold some liquor there. She never got a license because her name doesn't appear in any of the city liquor license logs. But Irish grocers were known to sell a little hooch out back. It was a great way to make a little extra money, keep it sort of under wraps. And along the way, her little place became kind of this neighborhood hub, like a lot of, it's like a bodega today. I've been through East Boston more recently, and it's still like this. You see these little Brazilian or South American bodegas on the corners of East Boston, like any other city in America. And they're just these earnest startup shops, right? Like where immigrants get the ball rolling. And that's what her place was like back in the 1860s. Nothing fancy, but a place where she was in control. She was the boss. She was running the show. And she was making way more money than she was either as a hairdresser and for sure as a maid. So she advances pretty quickly and pretty impressively. By the late 1870s, she actually owns one of the buildings where her shop is on the first floor, and in time buys the building next to that. So she owns two buildings, has a mortgage. I found the mortgage. Her daughter's name was on it too, so I think she got the family involved in the business. She rented out the apartments above the grocery store to incoming immigrants and other family members. So pretty quickly, she turns into this savvy businesswoman and entrepreneur who owns real estate. She's a landlady. She's an entrepreneur. And I think it's just amazing that in a relatively short period of time, she goes from a widowed maid just struggling with these four kids to a successful businesswoman. And I think a lot of that then transfers to the next generation, her daughters and her son, PJ. And we can talk about him next a little bit. But it all goes back to her and her business savvy, her grit and determination, not only to just sort of make it, but to really make it, to be a success and to be her own boss.
Yeah. And so this makes me think of Honey Fitzgerald. How does this story compare to Honey Fitz and his family story? Because the families come together eventually. What happens there?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating sort of collision of these two families. Honey Fitz, John Fitzgerald, also the son of a grocer, also lost his father. just like PJ. So Bridget's son, who was born in 1858, PJ, he and Honey Fitz are kind of contemporaries. They grew up in different neighborhoods, but their lives start to intersect a few years later. In PJ's case, because he's been exposed to his mother's entrepreneurship, he's kind of a troublemaker as a kid. He spends time on Deer Island, where there's a juvenile detention center, probably for truancy, it seems to be. But then he starts working on the docks of East Boston. He's a longshoreman. Then he rises a step up to become a stevedore, kind of overseeing the longshoremen. And then at some point, he decides, like his mother, to start his own business and buys a rundown saloon, South Boston, off Washington Street. No, sorry, Haywood Street. I think it was called the Haywood Street Saloon. Runs that for a little while, and then buys another saloon in East Boston, which happens to be right next door to the Democratic ward headquarters for East Boston. So that's the beginning of the family's connection to politics, and that starts with PJ. So he's a saloon keeper. He's well known in the community. He starts befriending the politicians who are working out of the ward office, which is right next door to his saloon. They stop by for a drink at the end of the day, and this starts to build into this sort of dual career for him, where he's a kind of a foot soldier for the very overwhelmed and very much in the minority Democratic Party of Boston at that time, and running his saloon business, which expands from one saloon to two to three. Then he runs a retail liquor business and then a wholesale liquor business, all while his mother is still running her shop. So this family starts to really rise up to the middle class and becomes a success. Family members start to come over from Ireland and live with them or near them. And along the way, PJ's interest in politics brings him in contact with Honey Fitz, who has a relatively similar trajectory, working for the city along the way and then getting very interested in politics. And I think in both cases, Honey Fitz and PJ, they saw politics as a way out, or at least a way up to the next level. And both of them started serving together at the State House right downtown. Both as initially as, well, PJ was first a state representative, ran for elected office in 1885, same year that Boston elected its first Irish Catholic mayor, Hugh O'Neill. And that was the start of his political career. And around the same time, I don't have Honey Fitz's dates exactly right, but at some point they both end up as state senators sitting side by side in the State House. And that's how they get to know each other. And that's the beginning of these two families beginning to come together.
It's such an amazing story. And you bring to life that transformation from this Boston Brahmin city that is so filled with bigotry, and the Irish continue to just keep chipping away, rising up, and they reach elected office. And now that's what we know about Boston, is Irish Boston. So it's an amazing story. Now, how did the children, Bridget's children, become educated? What was that like for them at the time? Did they go to Catholic schools, or was it public school?
There wasn't much available to them initially, and I wasn't able to find all the records. I know all of them had some schooling. There were public schools that they could go to, but at that time it was really the beginning of parochial schools in Boston. I don't know when they officially started or when they sort of gained traction, but it was very much in response to the bigotry that families faced, sending their kids to public schools. And in many cases, if they were Irish, the teachers and headmasters would go out of their way to force them to do things that they knew went against their own religion. There were stories about kids in the public schools being forced to say the Protestant version of the Lord's Prayer, or to study very English-centric versions of history that either deleted or overlooked, Irish pieces of that history. And so a lot of families, and there's stories of kids getting whipped for not doing the right thing, for not saying the Lord's Prayer the right way. And a lot of Irish families over time got fed up and said, let's just screw it. Let's start our own schools. And it took a while, but that really began in Boston. I don't have evidence that Bridget's daughters or PJ went to parochial schools. And it also seems that like they all left at a relatively young age. I think the requirement was, I think Massachusetts was fairly progressive in with mandatory attendance at school. It was ahead of many other states. You had to go to school up until a certain age, and I think it's one reason why truancy was a big problem, and they clamped down on it a lot. It's probably why PJ ended up on Deer Island. But it seems like they all left when they could, which was, I think, 14. It could be off a little bit. If anyone knows, give me a thumbs up. But yeah, I think most of them left to go to work. That's what they wanted to do. So they had a little bit of education, and then when they were able to bail and start working, that's what they did.
Well, I know that in Boston, it might have been 14. There might have been a push to put it down to 12, but a lot of the business owners or factory owners wanted those kids in the factories at like 10 and 12 years old, and Massachusetts was pushing back. So, it was muddied at that time, and what community could get away with doing whatever. And of course, these kids brought in money to the families, and it was hard to force the parents to get their kids back into school.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite stories about Bridget, Patrick, PJ, from your research?
Yeah, I think there are many. I love that. I love your question about Honey Fitz and PJ, because they, even though they were contemporaries and political peers and colleagues, they did not like each other initially. Honey Fitz was full of himself and boisterous and drunk most of the time, and PJ was much more reserved. Just sort of kept his head down and worked hard, often on behalf of other people. I think PJ was a really fascinating character. Along the way, I was able to get access at the JFK Library to PJ Kennedy's papers, which sounds better than it is. It's not that much, but it's a few hundred pages of his personal letters, starting in the late 1800s, going up to his death in 1929. But reading through those letters, you really get a sense of who PJ was at the time. Super hardworking. I mean, he went from, saloon owner to politician. Then he helped open a bank with a number of colleagues in East Boston. He ran a coffin making company. He ran a coal company. I mean, he was just involved in all these things, and he was involved in real estate, buying and selling real estate. But he was modest. He was a modest guy. And in these letters that I referred to, he's always looking for a way to help other people, like writing a letter to some politician or business owner or school headmaster saying, hey, such and such just came over on the boat. Can we help them find a place in your classroom? Or can we help them find a place to live? Or can we help them find a job? Really always on the lookout for being helpful to his community, to his constituents. I think in Honey Fitz's case, and I love the guy, but I think he was more devoted to Honey Fitz than to, he wanted to get elected, and he loved the attention of the job. I think PJ saw the job of politician, and then later kind of this emeritus kind of ward boss status that he had, pulling levers from the background, but it was all around helping the community and helping other people. So I loved a lot of those stories of seeing PJ in action, actually helping others, which I believe must have been the lessons that were passed down to him from Bridget. There's this direct connection. He was surrounded by these strong women his whole life, raised by 3 older sisters, raised by his mother, raised by aunts. And I think that influence of all these strong women, it's what made PJ who he was. At the tail end of my book, I get just briefly into Joe and argue that, something got missed along the way. Some of those lessons, you could argue maybe skipped over Joe or took a different twist. He was born wealthy. Joe was, thanks to his father, PJ. He did not work himself up pull himself up from the bootstraps. Bootstraps were already up, or however you want to put it. He was a silver spoon kid. Took the family from that point forward on his shoulders and really, elevated them in terms of power and wealth to this stratospheric level. But I think he lost humility along the way. He lost a sense of, whatever, fidelity, you name it. Any of the sins that he's been accused of over the years, they got lost along the way as he sought power for himself and his family and his sons in particular. Right. But I think that's why I was so interested in really focusing my efforts in this book on Bridget and PJ, because I think their stories have been lost as we've gotten deeper into 20th century Kennedy history.
And that's what I really like about this book, is because you really demonstrate the roots of that sense of service and obligation that the Kennedys that we know, not Joe, who does seem like an aberration in a way, but though his children and had that sense of service, and it continued on, and the commitment to democratic principles and values, etc. And it's clear in Bridget and Patrick, and that's what I really love, that you tell these amazing stories about that. What about the sisters? What happened to the sisters?
All got married and had kids of their own. Their stories sort of, as you might imagine, sort of fade away as we get into 20th century Kennedy history and lore, and their stories are lesser known, and so the trail sort of peters out a little bit. I found some descendants from that side of the family, from PJ's sisters, descendants. But I think in a similar way, they also didn't know much about their family in the past. I think they had this pride of being descendant from Irish immigrants connected to the Kennedys. But I wasn't able to find any member in that part of the family that got involved in politics and followed the same path that PJ and others did. But I had a point about, I think another thing that I found fascinating as you look at Joe and other members of the family moving forward is this relationship connection to Ireland. And I think in PJ's case, because he did travel to Ireland twice in his life, which was no small expense, but he went back to the family homestead in New Ross in County Wexford, which I've visited a couple times. And it's still owned by the Kennedy family to this day, descendants of the Kennedy family. That's where Patrick's family came from. But I think PJ cared about where he came from, and he cared about the history of his country. And I think you see that in JFK and other members of the family. You don't see it in Joe. I think Joe wanted, and he would say as much, we're Americans now. What does it take to be an American here? Like, he didn't want to be hyphenated. He didn't want to be an Irish American or descendant from Irish, poverty. He wanted to be an American success story, and that was his focus. And to his credit, he achieved it, at the highest levels for himself and his family. But I came to appreciate those who continued to care about where they came from. And I think JFK is a great example of that. He goes back to Ireland in 1963 while he's president. He had visited a number of times prior to that as a politician and before then. And I think he really cared about his ancestry and how it influenced him and his life. And there are other members of the family where I think that was strongly the case, but not all. Yeah.
And the older Kennedy kids, JFK, his brother Joe, the older kids at least got to meet Patrick before he died. So at least for JFK, he probably was deeply maybe inspired by Patrick in some ways.
I think
Um,
so. Yeah, he did. He was old enough to have remembered him. JFK born in 1917 and PJ died in 1929. So,
yeah,
he was a 12-year-old kid that was old enough. And he remembered PJ as being kind of serious and stern, didn't want the kids goofing around or being silly. He, wanted them to just like play it straight. So I think he was a little bit gruff in that way, but he doted on them. He was known to bring them presents at their home and spent holidays with them. And at the JFK Library, there are a number of really wonderful photos of PJ with his grandkids out at the beach on the Cape. Nantucket and Hull. There are photos from there. So I think he great point, Kate. I think some of the kids. Having spent some time with PJ, his influence rubbed off.
right. And most of us just remember Honey Fitz because he lived so much longer and his personality was so big. And so when we think of those kids, you think of Honey Fitz and singing, his Irish songs to them and things like that. We
Right.
don't think of Patrick and his seriousness and the influences that he had in with his personality. Um, this book is so much fun. It is so interesting in so many ways. I encourage everybody to read it. So I'd love to open it up to questions. If some of the participants here have some questions, that would be great. If you just want to raise your hand or turn on your Mark, go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, Neil, thank you for coming on and enjoyed the book a lot. Um, I was actually, I think you made reference to the Know Nothings a while back, and one of the things that I was, I guess, a bit surprised by was stories you told about some of the, literal violence that happened in East Boston, and the sense I think of physical threat that Bridget and the family must have experienced at some point. And I was wondering if you could share some about that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Because that some of those uh, episodes shocked me. I think many of us might know in general terms of the discrimination that Irish Catholics were up against, and maybe we know a little bit about the Know Nothings, this political party that came into power in the mid 1850s. A version of what we're seeing now in certain parts of the country. These are folks who are running for office or not even running for office, just like going out of their way to suppress voting by immigrants, going out of their way to keep, in the case of the Know Nothings, keep Catholics and Irish from being able to hold public office. Trying to change the laws of the land to keep people disenfranchised. That was their mission, and they were at times very good at it. In the case of some of the threats that you mentioned, Mark, in East Boston, there were these, call them the Proud Boys of the day. They were these thugs who would march through East Boston, throwing bricks at Irish Catholic businesses, circling the cathedral where Bridget and Patrick attended mass with their family, and threatening priests. There's a story about a priest getting tarred and feathered by a group of Know Nothings. I mean, they were terrible, violent people. There was one nut job that I describe who called himself the Angel Gabriel, who would stand on the steps of a church or the courthouse steps or city hall, blowing his bugle and sort of dishing out this nonsense, this hatred against the newcomers to this country, and let's send them all back, and sort of the same build a wall type of nonsense that we've heard in recent years. That kind of anti-immigrant attitude was so strong, and you saw examples of it all the time in East Boston, right in Bridget and Patrick's own neighborhood, to the point where there were people marching by their house at times. These parades of Know Nothing vitriol, marching right by their kids and essentially threatening their lives. But I found that the tactics that some of those groups use were chilling, because it's the same kind of stuff that we see today of keeping the vote out of the hands of the people that you don't want to vote. It was remarkable and scary and resonant.
Fergus?
Hi, Neil. Thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating presentation. The Irish side of my family, Farrells and Madigans, came up. They were of the same generation and had a very similar trajectory up through politics as well, but in New York.
Ah.
So the question, I'll try to keep it simple, is whether in any of your research you saw the Kennedys interacting with Black Bostonians and commenting, thinking about Blacks, competitive with, not competitive with, and if you found anything, it would be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, thanks, Fergus, and thanks for being here. I didn't find much in my research on that. And I not for lack of trying, because I was very curious to try and understand what the relationship might have been, for example, between Bridget and maids like her around the time of emancipation, and a lot of freed Black families coming to Boston. I do know that Bridget and Patrick, or at that time it would have been just Bridget, that they had some Black neighbors. There was a boarding house that was near them in East Boston. And I found some evidence of Black maids in that area at that time. And I know more anecdotally than specific to the Kennedys that there was this tension between, sort of low-income Irish workers and low-income Black workers, both before and after the end of the Civil War. But I never found anything specific to the Kennedys. I would have loved to have understood, sort of, for example, where PJ felt, where he stood as related to, rights of Black families at that time in Boston, because they were trying to break in at that time, like poor Irish families were generations before, like his family was. So I would have loved to have understood better what his views on that were. I just couldn't find anything. I think it's much later that there's more direct evidence of some of the family's views on those types of racial relations. So just didn't get anything on that. But great question. Thanks, Fergus.
Barbara?
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Neil. Hi, I'm Barbara Perry, and I'm on the board of the Friends of the Kennedy Birthplace and National Historic Site. And I'm one of those Kennedy obsessed people you spoke about early on. And somehow I had missed the very premiere of your book. And so all of my family and friends, of course, know of my obsession. And so my older brother wrote to me and said, "Did you know about this new book on the first Kennedys?" And I said, "No. Oh, I must download it immediately." So I did, and I really loved it. Thank you so much. A question that I have, having written on Rose Kennedy and Edward Kennedy and others in the family, is an irony of the Irishness. And yet, once they go to England, and I've in the last few years, I've been doing for the English Speaking Union a talk on the Kennedys in London, in pre-war London. And if I always make a list of those who became Anglophiles, certainly Kathleen, Jack's sister, Kick, Pat, marrying Peter Lawford, Jack himself, and that I think in some ways he really represents that irony of loving Ireland and being so sentimental about it, but also being an Anglophile. Right. And Rose, his mother Rose, and to some extent Joe too. So how do you square that, going back to the roots that, again, thank you for this book, because I just didn't know any of those stories about the first Kennedys. So well done. And in a compelling way in which you narrate the story. But how do you explain that, what I'm calling an irony or a dichotomy of Anglophilic Irish Americans
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks, Barbara. And thank your brother for me for giving
I
you a heads
will.
up on the book.
I will.
I'm fascinated by that too. And I don't know if there's a book out there on that. If there isn't, I think there could be, because I think that's a really interesting aspect of the family history. I'll be honest, it's not one that I dove into deeply, because my book only goes up to really PJ Kennedy's death in 1929. But I do have an epilogue in my book that touches on some of this. And I'm just fascinated, for starters, that you've got, Joe Kennedy. In my case, I've written so much about the discrimination against the Irish, and I touch early on in the book about the history of British oppression of Ireland, centuries worth of keeping those people down, and the horrible things that were done to the Irish for so many years. In order to set up this tension between Ireland and England at the very beginning, including the things that England was accused of during the potato famine, of not helping to the extent that they probably should have or could have. And then you leap ahead a couple generations, a few, more than a couple, but a few, and you've got Joe Kennedy as the first Irish Catholic ambassador to Britain. And that fascinates me, that this grandson of a woman who would have spit at the Queen if she had the chance is kneeling before her and telling his children to kneel before the Queen. It's remarkable to me that things, change so much in such a relatively, to me, short period of time. And then, to your point, I think it's fascinating that the family is smitten by British royalty and the system and the pageantry of it all, some of which you see later in the so-called America's royal family, as they become
Right.
more successful and more accomplished and more fabulous, like the Kennedys that we know of. But I think that period where that all begins, when the family moves to London and start to experience life there, and then Kick, I think, is a fabulous example of like being completely fascinated by the culture and the people and marrying into it. And then, after her first husband's dead, sticking with the Brits for her next love affair. I think it's all remarkable. I think, again, I'm not the expert on this, but I do think along the way, even though JFK was an Anglophile, I think he also showed a deep curiosity and interest in his Irish roots and heritage. I don't know how that breaks out across other kids of his, his siblings, really. I don't know if he was the most interested or he just got more coverage for it because he later became president. But I think that's fascinating too, is that he did have this curiosity and appreciation for England and British history, while also pursuing his curiosity in Irish history and visiting a number of times. But I think it's also wild that Kick marries into a royal family, and they have an estate in Ireland, that is part of that tragic history of British oppression of those people. I mean, the whole relationship there is messy and weird and fascinating.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Are you going to write about it, Barbara? You haven't already started?
You've just given me an idea after my 2 pages of notes that I took from your wonderful talk and Kate's great questions. I'm put that down. I hope we can be in touch.
Yeah, reach out anytime. I think it'd be a really interesting story or book or something.
Great. Thank you.
And since bringing that up, I was thinking back on Rosemary. She spent a good amount of time in Ireland, and Rose and Joe hired Irish women or young women who appeared to be friends in the friend age of Rosemary, and they stayed with her and took her around Ireland. She spent a lot of time there, so she got more immersed in that Irish culture than her siblings did. So
how many years
really
was she there, Kate?
So Rosemary was there between 1938 and 1940, and then she was sent back in June of 1940 because of World War II. So it was several months in the summers of 38 and 39 that she spent in Ireland. And after I wrote my book, I was this man reached out to me. He was a journalist in Ireland, and his aunt, or two of his aunts, I think, had been these friends of Rosemary's that had been hired to take Rosemary around, be her companions. And he sent me some of the letters that they had. And so, that never dawned on me how that's kind of significant in this tension between England and Ireland and that Irish identity.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was going to say this earlier. I'm assuming some, if not all, of the folks on tonight's call are familiar with Kate's book Rosemary, but if you're not, it's a wonderful book and another sort of overlooked slice of that family's history. It's fabulous.
And Barbara has a fabulous book on Rose Kennedy, really fabulous book on Rose. So yeah, check that out. Anyone else have a question? Seth?
Great. Thank you so much, Neil and Kate, for asking some perfect questions to get Neil talking. I guess asking kind of first of all, I feel your pain. I'm writing a biography and starting with the grandparents, and they were prominent Chattanoogans, but I'm still finding, a lot of basically newspapers.com. That's like, and I'm struggling to write a chapter on the grandparents to sort of set up my protagonist. And you wrote a whole book about it. So go you. I mean, it's really amazing work. And received so well, and congratulations, really.
Thanks, Seth.
I think it's an important contribution, but I'd like to hear from you what you want that contribution to be, thinking more sort of as a historian, the historiographical sort of context. How does, I guess, specifically Bridget's story is kind of the embodiment of humility. And I think maybe she fits perfectly with that idea of, well-behaved women rarely make history. That's actually what the quote was meant, to describe from Ulrich, unless, your progeny becomes president, and then you make history. But what would you say changes the story by going back to the point where you do? How does that, is that a correction to the Kennedy mystique or the legacy? Or is that something that adds to it? And I'm sure that's something that kind of motivated you, thinking, where does this fit into all the books about the Kennedys? And clearly, chronologically, it's different, but how does that maybe change the story, or on what level does it?
Yeah. I like that question, and I'm going to touch base with you offline because I want to hear more about your project. But I think that question drove a lot of my passion for sticking with this story over so many years. Like as Kate and I discussed in the very beginning, who needs another Kennedy book, right? Like it's all been done. But I felt like once I learned enough about Bridget and Patrick and PJ too, my book very much focuses first half on Bridget, second half on PJ. And I feel like they're both completely overlooked or forgotten, either accidentally or intentionally, or some combination of the both. Overlooked characters in the history of, one of the most famous and influential families in American history, or modern American history, at least. And I guess I didn't necessarily think that bringing them and their stories to life was a corrective, but an addition to, and adding context to the family history, a piece of that family history that I think is important, and we should know who these people are, because they PJ and Bridget before him had such a lasting influence on that whole family. And they teach us a lot, I think, about just the immigrant experience in America. They're perfect examples of hardworking newcomers to a country that doesn't want them, sticking with it and working hard and making it and establishing a life, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after. And that's what happened in the Kennedys' case. And then, it reaches these extreme heights in their case. So I wanted it to be an addition to and a contextualization of the Kennedy history, but also to sort of poke people on the shoulder and say, hey, the real hero of this story, the matriarch of that whole family, is Bridget. I think the Kennedy history is too entrenched, too established, too set for this to be a corrective. I don't think people are going to have their minds changed strongly one way or the other. But if I can get through to enough people and say, hey, you might know most of the story, but here's a piece of the story that you might not know, and it's an important and fascinating and entertaining piece of it, and it helps contextualize the rest. I think that's what I was hoping would come from this.
So I have a couple questions. One is how much, so it's remarkable to me that the family is still intensely Catholic. Their faith is still a big part of their lives. And so it's interesting after reading your book to think about what Bridget and Patrick went through, and yet that family still is so, I mean, they haven't lost that. And in some ways, the family is even more intense. Some members of the family are more intensely religious. And in this, 21st century, it is surprising. So reading your book, to know what Bridget went through and the family went through, it shows a side of, we're not giving this up. We're just we're standing strong. So I'd like you to comment on that. And then my second question is, have you heard from any of the Kennedys about the book after it came out?
On the Catholic question, I think I expected to come across more evidence of their faith from the early days, and a lot of reasons why that didn't end up being the case. I mean, I know that they were a member of I think it was the Church of the Most Holy Redeemer in East Boston. It was their parish and church for many years. Bridget and Patrick and PJ. So I know that they were devout. I know PJ's wife, who I failed to mention earlier, Mary Augusta Hickey, whom he married in 1887. Very devout woman, very involved in her church. She sang in the choir and played I think she played organ. I know she was a very devout Catholic, and so maybe somewhere in there, she and PJ instilled this sense of faith in their kids, Joe and his sisters. But I just didn't see a whole lot of examples of that. I think, maybe this would be a good question for Barbara, because I get the sense that Rose was maybe the force when it came to keeping the family close to the Catholic Church. That's always been my sense, but I don't know if that's entirely true. Barbara says yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that was, but I just don't know enough about the transition from Irish Catholic in Ireland, meaning Bridget and Patrick, on up to Rose and Joe and their kids. But from what I've read over the years, I do think Rose was very influential when it came to the family's faith. And then in terms of hearing from family members, not a whole lot. Like not exactly crickets, but I did contact a lot of family members to say, hey, I'm working on this book. If you have anything to share, I'd love to hear. I mentioned, Maria Shriver saying, I don't know, looking forward to your book and learning more about my own family. I think Rory Kennedy was maybe among the more interested who I was able to connect with. And I should say, especially Carrie Kennedy was generous with her time, tried to help me understand certain things, but she would even say that she just didn't know enough to really fully offer detailed history about her family, but I think she was very interested. She contributed a lovely afterword to the paperback of the first Kennedys that really focused on Bridget and the idea of her being the matriarch of this family, and we wouldn't be here without her. So I thought that said a lot about at least some family members appreciating what Bridget gave them and how they owe a lot to her strength and efforts way back when.
That's really nice. That's really nice.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us what your next project is, or are you keeping that under wraps?
Not under wraps. It's just messy.
Oh, really?
Oh man, you're not familiar with that at all, are you? It's I think it's a World War II spy story set in Honolulu. But it keeps shifting. But that's the gist of it for now.
Yeah. So messy but fun too, I hope.
Yeah. More what I like to think of as forgotten history. So this little piece of pre-World War II history that happened in Hawaii that I hope will bring these interesting characters back to life.
That's fantastic.
How about you? What are you working on?
I'm not ready to talk about it.
Okay.
It's really messy.
You can tell me later.
Yeah. Anyone else have comments or questions, Fergus?
Neil, would you care to add anything at all about the earlier history in Ireland before the emigration? What their world was like there? You alluded to it in an interesting way, and I wonder how far back you went. Did you go as far back as the rebellion of 1798? Did that touch on them at all? And anything you'd care to add?
Yeah, that's an interesting question / comment, and I tried to go back, but I realized, and maybe this is something Seth is dealing with. Like, I realized I could have written a whole book about that early stuff, and I had to drag myself away. So I almost intentionally didn't go deep on the rebellion of 1798. There are other books about the Kennedys that go a little bit into that and show that Patrick Kennedy's family was likely involved in that uprising and probably fought, and maybe some of them shed blood. What was it? Vinegar Hill and 3 Bullet Gate. Am I getting some of this right? This hill up above New Ross where some of the rebels took a stand fighting against British soldiers. But I didn't ever manage any expertise on that piece of the story, except to at least hopefully get myself grounded in where the family came from and knowing that they were poor farmers, oppressed, didn't own their own land, had to pay everything to their English landowners. There is a little bit in the book about the Kennedys, landlord and landlady in their case. Some quirky, interesting backstories there, but I found it fascinating that Irish tenant farmers didn't own anything. They couldn't hold public office. They couldn't speak. They weren't supposed to speak their own language. They weren't supposed to study their own religion. They were just like quashed at every turn. And I think that says a lot about who the Irish character in general and the Kennedys in particular. They were just slapped around all the time, and including when they got to America. So that I think some of that deeper history of the Kennedys in Ireland itself is fascinating, but I didn't go too deep into it myself.
That's great. Anyone else? Jess, do you have anything to add to this, or?
No, just a really big thank you to both of you for tonight. This is wonderful.
It was so fun. Yeah. Kate, thank you so much for the questions and conversation. I loved it. It was great to hang out together again.
Yeah. And the book is great. Everybody, you got to read it. It's really good. It's really fascinating.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much. Well, thanks for
Thank you,
joining
Jeff.
us, everyone.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
the questions.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you.
Have a
all.
good night. Hope